In every generation, people have searched for a deeper connection with their Creator, longing to understand His will, His guidance, and His presence. The desire to hear God clearly is not limited to religious scholars, spiritual leaders, or people living isolated from the world. It is a universal human longing, felt by ordinary individuals in everyday life. When life becomes confusing, when decisions become heavy, or when the heart becomes restless, many turn inward and upward, hoping for clarity, hope, and direction from God. But the question arises, how do we hear God clearly? Is it a voice? Is it a feeling? Is it a sign? Or is it something much deeper? Hearing God is not always about dramatic experiences or supernatural events. In most cases, it is a gentle, quiet, and deeply personal process. It is the strengthening of the heart, the sharpening of intuition, and the calming of the mind. God often speaks in silence, in moments of reflection, through wisdom, through peace, and through the circumstances around us. But because life today is filled with noise, social media distractions, internal fears, overthinking, stress, and the pressure of daily responsibilities, many people lose the ability to recognize God's whisper. They are not spiritually deaf, they are simply overwhelmed. To hear God clearly, a person must cultivate inner stillness, sincerity, and openness. It requires a heart that is ready to listen, not just a mind seeking instant answers. It requires patience, because divine guidance often unfolds slowly. It requires humility, because God's guidance may challenge our desires and push us toward better choices. And it requires trust, because God's timing is often different from ours, but always wiser. Another essential aspect of hearing God is understanding that He speaks in many different ways. Sometimes through scriptures, sometimes through gut feelings, sometimes through people, sometimes through opportunities, and sometimes through closed doors. God also speaks through peace. When something is right, the heart feels settled, and when something is wrong, the heart feels heavy and disturbed. This spiritual sensitivity grows through practice, reflection, and consistency. People often expect a loud, undeniable message, but God's communication is usually subtle. It is more like guidance than a command, more like direction than a speech, and the clearer the heart becomes, through prayer, gratitude, patience, and righteous living, the clearer His message becomes. This topic matters because countless people today feel lost. They struggle with mental noise, emotional pain, and uncertainty about their purpose. They want clarity, but they don't know where to find it. Learning how to hear God clearly can transform a person's life. It brings inner peace, strong decision making, emotional healing, and deep spiritual confidence. It allows one to move through life with purpose instead of confusion, with faith instead of fear, with strength instead of anxiety. Ultimately, God is always speaking. The real question is, are we listening? When the heart becomes still and sincere, the noise fades, and the guidance becomes unmistakable. This journey is not about magic, it is about connection. Not about force, but about faith, and not about perfection, but about seeking God with an honest heart. One of the biggest reasons people struggle to hear God clearly is because their inner world is too loud. The heart is full of overthinking, stress, fear, doubts, and emotional clutter. Imagine trying to listen to a soft whisper while standing in the middle of a loud marketplace. The voice is there, but the noise makes it impossible to hear. In the same way, God's guidance is often gentle, subtle, and calm. It cannot be recognized when the mind is chaotic or the heart is restless. That's why the first key to hearing God clearly is learning how to silence your inner noise. Inner noise is not just the thoughts in your mind. It is also the weight of unhealed emotions, the pressure of daily problems, and the influence of negative voices from outside. When you are constantly distracted, constantly scrolling, constantly comparing yourself, constantly worrying about the future, your spiritual senses become dull. God is still speaking, but the message gets buried under layers of mental and emotional clutter. So the first step is not to try harder to hear God. The first step is to slow down and create space for Him to speak. Silencing inner noise begins with awareness. You must first recognize when your mind is overloaded. Many people go through their day without realizing how tense or mentally busy they are. Start by taking intentional pauses. Sit in quietness, breathe deeply, and allow your thoughts to settle. This is not just relaxation. It is spiritual preparation. A calm heart becomes a receptive heart, and a receptive heart becomes a guided heart. Another important part of silencing inner noise is detaching from things that drain your peace. This may include toxic people, unhealthy environments, bad habits, or constant exposure to negativity. When your surroundings are chaotic, your inner world becomes chaotic too. But when you protect your peace, you create a clean space where God's guidance can land. Peace is not just a feeling. It is a spiritual channel. The more peaceful you are, the clearer God's voice becomes. Silencing inner noise also requires letting go of emotional burdens. God's guidance cannot be heard clearly when the heart is full of anger, resentment, guilt, or fear. These emotions create layers around the soul, blocking spiritual clarity. Through prayer, forgiveness, self-reflection, and surrender, these emotional blockages slowly dissolve. The heart becomes lighter, and divine guidance flows more freely. Another way to reduce inner noise is by limiting mental overstimulation. In today's world, people consume endless information: videos, posts, messages, opinions, drama, and noise. When the mind is constantly fed with stimulation, it becomes restless and scattered. Set boundaries. Give your mind time to breathe. Replace unnecessary noise with meaningful stillness. When silence becomes part of your life, you begin to notice subtle things: soft feelings, small signs, sudden clarity, or strong intuition. These are often ways God communicates, but without quietness, these moments go unnoticed. The truth is simple: God is not silent. We are simply too loud inside. When you quiet your inner world, His guidance becomes clearer, stronger, and unmistakable. Silence is not empty. It is full of God's voice. One of the deepest truths about hearing God clearly is this: clarity comes from consistency. Just as a person cannot build a strong friendship by talking once in a while, you cannot build a strong spiritual connection without regular communication with God. Most people only seek God when they are stressed, confused, or desperate. In those moments, they expect instant answers, instant clarity, and instant peace. But a relationship that is only activated in crisis cannot produce depth, trust, or spiritual sensitivity. Developing a consistent connection with God means talking to Him daily. When you're happy, when you're calm, when you're grateful, not just when you're overwhelmed. The more consistently you connect, the more familiar His guidance becomes. You begin to recognize the difference between your emotions, your fears, and God's direction. Spiritual clarity is not an event, it is a habit. Consistency builds sensitivity. When you regularly spend time in prayer, reflection, or quiet communion with God, your heart becomes tuned to His frequency. Think of it like tuning a radio. You cannot hear the station clearly unless you adjust the dial. God's voice is steady, but our hearts must be tuned. With daily connection, the static of life reduces. Your intuition sharpens. Your spiritual awareness strengthens. You begin to feel guided even in simple things: small decisions, daily thoughts, and emotional responses. This consistent connection does not have to be complicated. It can be a few quiet minutes in the morning or at night, A simple conversation with God during your day, or a moment of reflection when your mind feels scattered. What matters is sincerity. God does not require long, formal words. He listens to the heart, not the vocabulary. A consistent "God, guide me," or "God, I trust you," builds a stronger spiritual bond than hours of disconnected rituals. Another part of consistency is making space for God in your daily routine. If your entire day is filled with rush, noise, and constant stimulation, there is no room left for spiritual awareness. Build small spiritual habits, moments of gratitude, moments of stillness, moments of reflection. Over time, these habits create a lifestyle where God's presence feels natural, not distant. Consistency also increases trust. The more time you spend with God, the more you begin to see how He works in your life, how He protects you, elevates you, redirects you, and warns you. When you notice His patterns, you stop panicking when something goes wrong. You begin to understand that delays are protection, closed doors are redirection, and challenges are preparation. This level of trust allows you to hear His guidance without fear or confusion. A consistent connection also strengthens your spiritual identity. You no longer feel lost or disconnected. You feel grounded. You begin to recognize that God is not just someone you pray to. He becomes the center of your decisions, your peace, and your strength. Ultimately, the more you consistently connect with God, the clearer His voice becomes. Relationship brings recognition. Habit brings clarity. And consistency brings spiritual confidence. One of the most powerful steps in hearing God clearly is learning to recognize His voice. Many people expect God to speak in dramatic, loud, or supernatural ways. They imagine a thunderous voice from the sky or a sudden miracle-like moment. But in reality, God's voice is often gentle, subtle, and quiet. It speaks to the heart, not to the ears. It guides through peace, not pressure. It leads through clarity, not confusion. When you understand how God speaks, you begin to recognize His guidance more easily. God's voice is consistent with wisdom. It never pushes you toward impulsiveness, revenge, or negativity. It never asks you to harm yourself or others. It never creates anxiety or fear. God's voice brings calmness, direction, and inner certainty. Even when He warns you or redirects you, His voice has a tone of protection, not panic. One of the main ways God speaks is through inner peace. When something is right for you, your heart feels settled, even if the decision is difficult. When something is wrong, your heart feels disturbed, even if the option looks attractive. This spiritual peace is not emotional excitement. It is a deep, quiet knowing. Learning to recognize this inner signal is one of the strongest ways to hear God. Another way God speaks is through gentle nudges or intuition. You may feel guided toward a certain path, person, or opportunity without knowing why. You may suddenly feel the need to stop, reconsider, or step away from something. These small nudges are often divine whispers. They don't shout, they guide softly. When your heart is aligned with God, intuition becomes a spiritual tool rather than random feelings. God also speaks through clarity, especially after confusion. You may struggle with a decision for days, but after prayer or reflection, you suddenly feel certain about what to do. That shift from uncertainty to clarity is often God's response. It may not come instantly, but it will come with peace and assurance. Another powerful way God communicates is through signs and circumstances. Sometimes doors close unexpectedly. Sometimes relationships end. Sometimes opportunities fall apart or appear suddenly. These moments are messages. God often guides by rearranging circumstances to move you away from what is harmful and toward what is better. Recognizing these patterns requires spiritual awareness. God also speaks through scripture and wisdom. When you seek answers, you may come across a verse, quote, or message that perfectly matches your situation. This is not coincidence, it is divine alignment. God sends clarity through knowledge and reminds you of truths you already know deep inside. Most importantly, God's voice always aligns with goodness, growth, and truth. It strengthens your character, increases your peace, and guides you toward what is right, not what is easy. If a voice inside you leads toward chaos, fear, hate, or destruction, it is not from God. Learning to recognize God's voice takes time. It grows as your relationship with Him deepens. But once you learn the difference between emotional noise and divine guidance, your life becomes clearer. You move with confidence, make decisions with strength, and walk with a sense of purpose. You no longer chase answers, you receive them. And in every step, you feel guided, protected, and deeply connected to God to hear God clearly. It's not only about seeking Him, it's also about removing the things that block His guidance. Many people wonder why they cannot feel God's presence or understand His messages, even when they pray sincerely. The truth is, God is always communicating, but certain habits, emotions, and environments act like spiritual walls. Clearing these barriers is essential for receiving divine clarity. One of the biggest blocks is a heart filled with negativity, anger, resentment, jealousy, bitterness, or hatred. These emotions create heavy energy inside the soul, making spiritual sensitivity weak. When the heart is burdened, it becomes difficult to recognize God's whispers. Forgiving others, letting go of grudges, and releasing pain are not only emotional choices, they are spiritual cleansing. The lighter your heart becomes, the easier it is to sense God's guidance. Another block is constant sin or guilt that is not addressed. When a person knowingly lives in behaviors that distance them from goodness, their spiritual instincts become numb. This doesn't mean God abandons them. It means the person's heart becomes less responsive. Just like a room with dirty windows cannot let sunlight in, a heart clouded with guilt or wrong habits struggles to receive spiritual clarity. Repentance, reflection, and making small steps toward improvement cleanse the soul and open spiritual hearing. Overthinking is another major block. Many people confuse their fears with God's voice. They analyze every thought until they feel stuck, not guided. Overthinking is mental noise that distracts from divine guidance. God's voice brings calm, not panic. Learning to trust, let go, and stop forcing answers helps you hear God more naturally. Toxic environments and relationships also block spiritual hearing. When you surround yourself with negative people, those who lie, manipulate, gossip, or constantly bring drama, your spiritual alignment becomes disturbed. You absorb their energy, their stress, and their state of mind. To hear God clearly, your environment must support peace, not chaos. Sometimes God's message becomes clear the moment you step away from the wrong people. Another block is impatience. Many people want God to answer instantly. When He doesn't, they panic, doubt, or assume He is silent. But impatience creates spiritual blindness. God's timing is perfect, and His silence is often protection. When you relax, trust, and stop rushing the process, your spiritual hearing becomes sharper. Patience opens doors that panic keeps closed. Lack of gratitude also blocks spiritual insight. A heart that constantly focuses on what's missing becomes blind to the blessings God is already giving. Gratitude softens the heart, and a soft heart hears God more clearly. When you appreciate what you have, your spiritual awareness expands. Finally, disconnection from self is a block. When you don't know yourself, your emotions, your needs, your wounds, you struggle to separate your inner voice from God's guidance. Self-awareness is a spiritual skill. The more you understand your heart, the more you understand how God speaks to it. Removing these blocks is like clearing dust from a mirror. The reflection, the guidance, was always there, it was just hidden. When your heart becomes clear, God's voice becomes unmistakable. Guidance flows naturally, peace replaces confusion, and your path becomes illuminated. One of the most overlooked keys to hearing God clearly is learning to follow the guidance you have already been given. Many people keep asking God for new signs, new answers, and new directions, while ignoring the wisdom, warnings, or instructions He has already placed in their hearts. Spiritual clarity does not grow by asking for more. It grows by obeying what you already know. God often gives guidance step by step, not all at once. He may show you the first step, but not the next 10. He may tell you what to leave before telling you what to choose. He may guide you to stop something harmful before guiding you towards something better. But if you ignore that first step, the next ones will never appear. Obedience builds clarity. Hesitation creates confusion. When you act on the small guidance, the larger guidance becomes visible. Many times, God's first answer is very simple. Slow down, walk away, heal, focus on yourself. Be patient, let go, or stay strong. These may not feel dramatic, but these are powerful spiritual directions. When people ignore these instructions and keep pushing for their own desires, they end up wondering why God feels distant. The truth is, divine clarity grows with alignment. When your actions align with God's direction, He reveals more. Another important part of following previous guidance is trusting that God speaks with purpose. If you feel strongly pulled away from someone or something, that is not random. If you feel peace in one direction and discomfort in another, that is not accidental. If you feel calm when you think about a path and anxiety when you think about another, that is part of the guidance. When you honor those inner signals, you are honoring God's voice. Sometimes the reason people don't hear God clearly is because they are hoping He will change His answer. They hear the guidance, but it is not what they want. They want God to confirm their desires, not His wisdom. But God does not adjust His guidance to fit our wishes. He gives direction based on protection, growth, and destiny. When you let go of what you want and surrender to what God knows is right, clarity increases. When you insist on your own way, confusion begins. Obeying earlier guidance also builds spiritual maturity. When God sees that you take His direction seriously, He trusts you with deeper insights. It is similar to a teacher who gives more responsibility to students. Listen, a person who obeys small guidance receives bigger guidance. A person who ignores small warnings becomes spiritually insensitive. Following previous guidance also strengthens faith. Many times, God asks you to take a step that doesn't make sense immediately, but later you realize it was the best thing that could ever happen. When you follow His lead, even without full understanding, you begin to see how He works behind the scenes. That experience builds spiritual confidence, making it easier to hear Him in the future. Ultimately, God is not silent. He is waiting for you to act on what He already said. When you follow the guidance you've received, you unlock the guidance you've been waiting for. Obedience opens doors, clears confusion, and brings divine direction into every part of your life. One of the most powerful ways to hear God clearly is by strengthening your spiritual sensitivity. Just like physical senses can become sharper with practice, such as vision, hearing, or touch, your spiritual senses also grow stronger when you nurture them. Many people cannot recognize God's guidance not because He is silent, but because their spiritual sensitivity is weak. A spiritually sensitive heart can detect divine signals that others overlook. It notices small feelings, subtle shifts, sudden clarity, and quiet warnings. To hear God clearly, you must train your heart to be spiritually awake. Spiritual sensitivity begins with awareness. This means paying attention to your inner world, your intuition, your emotional shifts, and the energy around you. God often speaks through gentle impressions, not loud commands. When your heart becomes attentive, you begin to notice things that are not accidental, certain thoughts that come during prayer, certain feelings during important decisions, or certain signs that repeat in your life. These small moments are often divine nudges. but without awareness, they feel random and go unnoticed. Another part of spiritual sensitivity is stillness. A noisy mind cannot hear God's whisper. When you practice stillness, quiet, moments of reflection, deep breathing, or peaceful silence, you allow your spiritual senses to sharpen. Stillness creates space for divine connection. In silence, your heart becomes more receptive, your intuition becomes clearer, and your mind becomes aligned with spiritual guidance. Mindfulness also increases sensitivity. Being present in the moment helps you notice how God guides you through everyday life. Sometimes He speaks through the right conversation, the right message, or the right thought at the right time. A mindful person recognizes these moments clearly because they are not distracted. Another powerful way to strengthen spiritual sensitivity is through prayer with sincerity, not formality. Many people pray out of habit but not from the heart. But when prayer becomes honest, emotional, and vulnerable, it awakens your spiritual senses. A sincere heart opens spiritual doors that a distracted mind cannot. When you talk to God with purity, you feel His response more clearly. Fasting, self-discipline, or cutting unnecessary distractions can also sharpen spiritual sensitivity. When you discipline your desires and detach from worldly noise, such as constant entertainment, drama, or negativity, your inner world becomes clearer. This clarity allows spiritual guidance to flow more easily. Spending time in nature is another effective method. Nature has a special calmness that softens the heart and increases awareness. Many people experience sudden clarity or emotional release when walking alone in quiet places. This is because the natural world reflects God's peace. Spiritual sensitivity also grows through reflection. At the end of the day, ask yourself, what did I feel today? What did I learn? What moments stood out? What felt right or wrong? Reflection helps you recognize patterns that God is using to guide you. Lastly, spiritual sensitivity grows when you stay away from things that darken your soul. Negative habits, toxic influences, and environments that drain your peace. A clean heart hears God more clearly. When your spiritual sensitivity becomes strong, you no longer rely only on signs. You begin to feel divine guidance. You sense warnings, recognize peace, detect danger, and understand God's direction instinctively. Your life becomes guided, not by fear, but by spiritual insight. One of the greatest truths about hearing God clearly is this: you cannot hear Him fully unless you trust Him deeply. Many people pray for guidance but still hold on to fear, doubts, and their own plans. They want God to speak, but only if His answer matches what they already want. They want clarity, but without surrender. They want direction, but without trust. But spiritual hearing does not work like that. You hear God most clearly when your heart is willing to trust what He says and accept His timing, even if it's not what you expected. Trust is the foundation of spiritual clarity. When you trust God, you stop forcing answers, you stop panicking, you stop demanding immediate solutions. Instead, you become patient, calm, and receptive. A trusting heart is a listening heart. A worried heart is a blocked heart. Worry creates noise, trust creates space. Space is where God speaks. God's timing is perfect, but it rarely matches our own. We want quick answers because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. We want doors to open fast because waiting feels difficult. But sometimes silence is not God ignoring you, it is God preparing you. Sometimes delays are not punishment, they are protection. Sometimes you haven't received the answer because your heart is not ready for it yet. When you trust His timing, you stop rushing the process. You allow God to work behind the scenes in ways you cannot see. Surrender is another essential part of hearing God clearly. Surrender does not mean giving up. It means letting go of your need to control the outcome. It means saying, God, guide me to what is best, not just what I want. When your heart is surrendered, God's voice becomes easier to recognize because it is no longer competing with your desires. When you cling tightly to your own expectations, you Hear your emotions, not his guidance, but when you surrender, you hear truth, not fear. Surrender also means trusting God even when his answer is wait, not yet, or not this. Many times, people ask God for signs, then ignore them because the answer requires sacrifice. You may feel God telling you to let go of a relationship, distance yourself from certain people, focus on your healing, or take a path that feels uncertain. But if you resist, the spiritual message becomes blurry. When you surrender, clarity increases. God's voice is loudest to the heart that is willing to obey. Another part of trusting God is believing that he sees things you cannot see. He knows who is wrong for you, what will harm you, what opportunities are traps, and which paths are disguised blessings. When you trust his wisdom more than your own emotions, your life becomes guided with precision. Protection. A person who trusts does not panic when God is silent. They know that silence has purpose. They do not rush into bad decisions. They wait, they believe, they stay aligned. They understand that everything God does, delays, redirections, endings, beginnings, is designed for their growth. In the end, hearing God clearly is not only about listening, it is about trusting. Trust removes fear. Surrender removes resistance. Together, they open the heart to divine clarity. When you fully trust God's timing and surrender your outcomes, his guidance becomes unmistakable. You no longer chase answers. Answers find you. Hearing God clearly is not a mysterious gift reserved for a few special people. It is a natural result of a heart that is calm, connected, purified, disciplined, and surrendered. Throughout your journey, you begin to realize that God is always speaking through your peace, through your intuition, through situations, through signs, through silence, and through the gentle pull inside your heart. The real challenge was never God's voice, it was learning to quiet your own. When you slow down, clear your mind, and center your spirit, divine guidance becomes easier to recognize. Hearing God is a process of alignment. Each key works together like pieces of a puzzle. When you silence your inner noise, your heart becomes receptive. When you build a consistent connection, your spiritual awareness grows. When you learn to recognize his voice, confusion fades. When you remove the blocks that cloud your heart, clarity flows more freely. When you follow the guidance you've already received, God trusts you with more. When you strengthen your spiritual sensitivity, your inner world becomes sharper and more aware. And when you trust God's timing and surrender your outcomes, his direction becomes unmistakable. This journey is not about perfection, it is about intention. You do not need to be flawless to hear God. You only need to be willing, open, humble, and sincere. Even the smallest step toward him brings you closer to clarity. God responds to genuine hearts, not perfect ones. The moment you begin seeking him with honesty, the path begins to open. You start seeing blessings more clearly, understanding experiences more deeply, and making decisions with more confidence. The beauty of hearing God is that it transforms the entire way you live. You no longer fear the future because you know you are guided. You no longer chase validation because you feel supported. You stop forcing situations because you trust divine timing. You stop begging for signs because now you can recognize them naturally. Your relationships change. Your decisions improve. Your peace becomes stronger, and your inner world becomes stable. You operate from wisdom, not emotion. You move with purpose, not pressure. And gradually, you start to notice that life flows more smoothly. Certain people leave, better people arrive. Certain doors close, new ones open. Problems become lessons, heartbreak becomes growth, silence becomes communication, and delays become preparation. You begin to see life through a spiritual lens rather than an emotional one. You feel protected, guided, and aligned even when you do not fully understand what is happening. Most importantly, hearing God clearly is about building a lifelong relationship. It is not a one-time answer. It is a journey of connection. Every season of your life brings new lessons, new signs, and new guidance. And as you grow spiritually, your ability to hear him becomes deeper and more refined. The end, the greatest peace comes from knowing you are not walking your path alone. God is with you in every decision, every struggle, every blessing, and every moment of silence. When you learn to hear Him clearly, life no longer feels chaotic. It feels guided. It feels purposeful. It feels connected, and that connection becomes your greatest strength, your greatest comfort, and your greatest source of clarity.